The last stop. I never thought much about train rides. They were just a part of my daily routine, a way to get from point A to point B. But that all changed one rainy evening in October, when I encountered something on the rails that I can never forget. The day had started off like any other. I worked a tedious office job in the city, spending my days in front of a computer, counting down the hours until I could go home. That evening, the sky was a swirling mass of dark clouds, and the first drops of rain began to fall as I hurried to catch the 8:15 train back to my suburban home. The station was unusually quiet when I arrived. The usual crowd of commuters thinned out by the weather. I pulled my coat tighter around me as I made my way to the platform, the cold wind biting at my skin. The train was late, which wasn't uncommon, but as the minutes ticked by, an uneasy feeling settled in my gut. There was something off about the night, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. When the train finally pulled into the station, it did so with a screech of metal that echoed through the empty platform. The doors slid open, and I stepped inside, shaking the rain from my umbrella. The car was nearly empty, with just a handful of passengers scattered throughout. I found an empty seat near the middle, close to the window, and settled in for the ride. As the train pulled away from the station, I stared out into the darkness, watching the rain streak down the glass in twisted patterns. The interior of the train was quiet, save for the low hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of a newspaper. I was tired, and my eyes grew heavy as the train rocked gently back and forth. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by the sound of a loud bang. I sat up, heart racing, and looked around. The other passengers didn't seem to have noticed anything, their heads bowed over their phones or books. I shook my head, trying to shake off the lingering sense of unease, and glanced out the window. That's when I saw him. He was standing on the platform of a station we had just passed, his figure barely visible in the dim light. He was tall, with a long coat that flapped in the wind, and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face. For a moment, I thought he was just another commuter waiting for a train, but something about him didn't seem right. There was something unnatural about the way he stood, too still, too rigid. The train sped past, leaving the station behind, and I blinked, wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. But the image of the man lingered in my mind, unsettling and strange. The rest of the ride was uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. When we finally pulled into my station, I was more than ready to get off the train and put the whole experience behind me. But as I stepped onto the platform, I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The station was deserted, the air thick with a sense of foreboding. I hurried through the empty corridors, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the walls, and pushed through the exit doors into the night. The walk to my house was a short one, but it felt longer than usual that night. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain fell in sheets, drenching me to the bone. I fumbled with my keys when I finally reached my front door, my hands shaking, though I couldn't explain why. Once inside, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, taking a deep breath to calm my nerves. The house was dark and silent, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. I peeled off my wet coat and shoes, leaving them in a soggy heap by the door, and made my way to the kitchen for a glass of water. As I stood at the sink, my mind kept drifting back to the man I had seen on the platform. There was something about him that was deeply unsettling, though I couldn't pinpoint what it was. I tried to push the thought away, chalking it up to my overactive imagination, but the feeling of unease lingered. I decided to go to bed early, hoping that a good night's sleep would chase away the strange sense of dread that had settled over me. But as I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My bedroom window faced the street, and as I passed by it, I glanced outside. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the street was empty, save for the dim glow of the street lamp. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. My heart skipped a beat as I turned to look, but there was nothing there, just the empty street, slick with rain and the shadows cast by the trees. I shook my head, telling myself I was being ridiculous, and drew the curtains shut. I climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin, and closed my eyes. But sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept drifting back to the man on the platform, to the way he had stood so still, like a statue carved from stone. I could still see him in my mind's eye, his face hidden in shadow, watching, waiting. When I finally did fall asleep, my dreams were filled with dark figures, lurking in the shadows, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. I woke several times during the night, drenched in sweat, the feeling of being watched never leaving me. The next morning, I felt exhausted, as though I hadn't slept at all. The events of the previous night seemed distant, like a bad dream, but the unease lingered. I tried to go about my day as usual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That evening, I found myself dreading the train ride home. The thought of stepping back onto that empty train car filled me with a sense of impending doom. But I couldn't avoid it. I had to get home. The station was just as empty as it had been the night before, the rain still falling in a steady drizzle. I hesitated on the platform, staring at the tracks, half expecting to see the man in the long coat standing there, waiting. But the platform was empty. When the train pulled in, I reluctantly boarded, my heart pounding in my chest. The car was empty again, save for a few distant figures at the far end. I took a seat near the middle, close to the window, and tried to calm my racing thoughts. The train lurched forward, and I stared out into the night, the rain blurring the landscape outside. I told myself that I was being silly, that there was nothing to be afraid of, but the sense of dread only grew stronger. I must have drifted off again, because when I opened my eyes, the train was stopped at a station. I looked out the window, and my breath caught in my throat. There, on the platform, was the man in the long coat. He was standing in the same spot as before, his figure obscured by shadow, but this time I could see his face, or what should have been his face. Instead, there was only darkness, a void where his features should have been. I stared in horror, unable to look away, as he slowly turned his head towards me. A chill ran through me as I realized that he was looking directly at me, his empty gaze piercing through the glass. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. As he took a step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. The train jolted forward, breaking the spell, and the station disappeared into the darkness. I gasped, my heart hammering in my chest, and looked around the car. The other passengers were oblivious, lost in their own worlds, but I knew what I had seen. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his featureless face, his dark figure standing on the platform, waiting. By morning, I was a wreck, my nerves frayed to the breaking point. I called in sick to work, unable to face the thought of another train ride. But as the day wore on, the fear grew stronger. I couldn't stay in the house, couldn't shake the feeling that he was out there, watching, waiting. I decided to leave town, to get as far away from that train line as possible. I packed a bag and headed to the station, my heart pounding with every step. The platform was empty, the train not due for another hour, but I couldn't wait. I had to get away. I sat on a bench, my eyes darting nervously around the empty station. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching into an eternity. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with tension, as if the world was holding its breath. When the train finally pulled in, I jumped to my feet, ready to board. But as the doors slid open, I froze. He was there, standing on the platform, his dark figure looming over me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. As he stepped closer, his featureless face inches from mine. The world seemed to tilt, the ground slipping out from under me. I stumbled back, my vision blurring, and everything went black. I woke up in a hospital bed, the harsh fluorescent lights burning into my eyes. My head throbbed, and I could barely remember how I had gotten there. A nurse came in, her face kind but concerned. She told me that I had been found unconscious on the train platform, that I had been brought in by an ambulance. They couldn't explain what had happened, but they told me I was lucky to be alive. I didn't feel lucky. The fear still clung to me, a cold weight in my chest. I knew that I had seen something real, something that didn't belong in this world. I left town after that, never looking back. I moved far away, to a place where trains were a distant memory, where I could try to forget what had happened. But the fear never left me. Even now, years later, I still wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the memory of that featureless face haunting my dreams. They say that trains are a way to travel, to get from one place to another. But some trains, some tracks, lead to places that were never meant to be found. Places where the shadows come to life, where the dead walk among the living, and where the darkness waits for those who dare to ride the midnight rails. So if you ever find yourself on a train late at night, and you see a man in a long coat standing on the platform, don't look at him. Don't meet his gaze. Just turn away and pray that the train doesn't stop. Because if it does, you might never leave. The train to nowhere. The small town of Ashton, nestled deep in the countryside, was known for its tranquility. The town had a charm that attracted tourists in the summer, but once the season ended, Ashton returned to its quiet, sleepy state. The old train station on the outskirts of town was a relic from a bygone era, rarely used except by the occasional visitor. However, there was one train that the locals never spoke of, a train that was whispered about only in hushed tones, known simply as the Midnight Express. No one knew when the Midnight Express first appeared, and most people in Ashton had never seen it. The train was said to run only once a month, on the night of the full moon, always at the stroke of midnight. It was an old steam engine, black as coal, with windows that reflected nothing but darkness. Those who had seen it or claimed to describe it as a ghostly apparition, an omen of doom. For most people, the Midnight Express was just a story, a piece of local folklore meant to scare children and entertain tourists. But for some, it was all too real. The first sightings. It was late October when Jacob, a young man in his 20s, arrived in Ashton. He was a city boy, taking a break from the hustle and bustle of urban life to spend a week in the countryside. Jacob had always been fascinated by ghost stories and urban legends, so when he heard about the Midnight Express from a local bartender, his curiosity was piqued. "That's just a story, right?" Jacob asked, sipping his beer. The bartender, a grizzled old man with deep-set eyes, leaned in closer. "That's what they say, but I've seen it, and I'll tell you this, it's not something you want to mess with." Jacob laughed it off, thinking it was all part of the town's charm. But the bartender's serious expression made him pause. "When did you see it?" "Years ago," the old man replied, his voice low. "I was walking home from the bar late one night. I heard the whistle first, long and mournful, like a soul crying out. I turned to see the train, all black and silent, gliding into the station. There were no passengers, no conductor, just that damn train, sitting there like it was waiting for someone. I didn't stick around to find out who. Jacob was intrigued. What happens if you get on? The bartender shook his head. Don't know. No one who's ever boarded has come back to tell the tale. The warning. Despite the bartender's warning, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling of excitement. He had come to Ashton looking for a story, and it seemed he had found one. Over the next few days, he asked around town, but most people refused to talk about the Midnight Express. Those who did offered only vague details, their eyes filled with fear. The night of the full moon approached, and Jacob decided he would go to the station to see the train for himself. He packed a small bag, just in case he decided to board, and set out for the station at around 11:30 that night. The town was eerily quiet as he walked through the deserted streets. The sky was clear, the full moon casting an otherworldly glow over the landscape. Jacob's footsteps echoed on the pavement as he neared the station, and he could feel his heart begin to race with anticipation. When he arrived at the station, it was completely empty. The old wooden benches were covered in dust, and the ticket booth was long abandoned. The platform was lit by a single flickering light, casting long shadows that seemed to dance in the corner of Jacob's vision. The arrival. Jacob checked his watch. It was 11:59 p.m. The air was still, the only sound the distant rustling of leaves. Then, as the clock struck midnight, he heard it, the long, mournful whistle of a train. It sent a shiver down his spine, the sound filled with a sadness that was almost tangible. Out of the darkness, the Midnight Express appeared, gliding silently into the station. Jacob's breath caught in his throat as he saw it. The train was exactly as the bartender had described, black as night, with windows that seemed to swallow the light. It came to a stop with a soft hiss of steam, and the doors slid open. For a moment, Jacob hesitated, but then his curiosity got the better of him, and he stepped forward, crossing the threshold onto the train. As soon as he did, the doors closed behind him with a soft thud, and the train began to move. Inside the train, the interior of the train was even more unsettling than the exterior. The seats were old and worn, the upholstery faded and torn in places. The lights overhead flickered dimly, casting eerie shadows along the walls. There was no sign of any other passengers, and the air was thick with a musty smell, like the scent of forgotten places. Jacob made his way down the narrow aisle, peering into the empty compartments. Each one was the same, dusty, abandoned, and filled with an overwhelming sense of dread. The further he went, the stronger the feeling of unease became, as if the train itself was alive, watching him, waiting for something. Finally, he reached the last compartment. Unlike the others, this one had a single occupant, a woman sitting by the window, her face turned away from him. Her long black hair covered her features, and she wore a simple, old-fashioned dress. "Excuse me," Jacob said hesitantly. "Is this your stop?" The woman didn't respond. She remained perfectly still, as if she hadn't heard him. Jacob felt a chill run down his spine. There was something deeply unsettling about her, something that made him want to turn and run, but his curiosity kept him rooted to the spot. He reached out to tap her on the shoulder, but before his hand could make contact, the woman's head snapped around to face him. Jacob gasped, stumbling back in horror. The woman's face was pale, almost translucent, with dark, hollow eyes that seemed to bore into his soul. Her mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. "Welcome aboard," she whispered, her voice a raspy hiss that sent a wave of terror through Jacob's body. The descent into darkness. Panic gripped Jacob as the train began to pick up speed, the landscape outside the windows blurring into darkness. He turned and ran back down the aisle, desperate to escape, but the train seemed to stretch on endlessly. The compartments, once empty, were now filled with shadowy figures, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The train hurtled forward, the sound of the wheels on the tracks growing louder, more chaotic. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest as he reached the door he had entered through, but it wouldn't budge. He pounded on it, screaming for help, but his voice was swallowed by the roar of the train. The lights flickered violently, and the shadowy figures began to move, slowly rising from their seats and advancing towards him. Their faces were twisted and contorted, their eyes filled with an insatiable hunger. Jacob backed away, his mind racing, trying to find a way out, but there was none. As the figures closed in, Jacob felt a cold, clammy hand grip his arm. He turned to see the woman from the last compartment, her twisted grin inches from his face. "There's no escape," she whispered. "This train has no destination, only an endless journey." Jacob screamed, his voice merging with the sound of the train as it plunged into complete darkness. The world outside the windows disappeared, replaced by a swirling void of blackness. The train shook violently, the walls closing in, the figures reaching out for him with clawed hands. The aftermath. When Jacob woke, he was lying on the platform of the Ashton train station. The first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon, and the station was once again empty and silent. He sat up, his body trembling, his mind racing with the horrors he had witnessed. The train was gone. There was no sign that it had ever been there, and the platform was just as dusty and abandoned as it had been the night before. But Jacob knew it hadn't been a dream. He could still feel the cold grip of the woman's hand on his arm, and the memory of her twisted grin haunted his every thought. Shaken and terrified, Jacob left Ashton that day, never to return. But the experience stayed with him, a constant reminder of the horrors that lurk just beyond the edge of reality. As for the Midnight Express, it continued its journey, unseen by most but always there, waiting for the next soul to board. The train had no destination, no end to its journey, only an endless loop through the darkness, collecting the lost and the damned. And so, the legend of the Midnight Express lived on, a terrifying tale whispered among the locals, a warning to those who might be tempted to seek out the unknown. For some stories are more than just tales, they are a doorway to a world where the line between the living and the dead is perilously thin, and where the price of curiosity is far more than anyone is willing to pay.